Hello everyone. So let's continue with our discussion on user research methods. Now we are going to discuss about research paradigm, the qualitative versus quantitative, which we had cursorily discussed in our previous lecture. So the main learning outcomes in today's lecture will be, we will be defining the qualitative and quantitative research paradigms and their philosophical underpinnings, and how on the basis of these philosophical underpinnings our questionnaires are designed differently. We will compare the strengths and limitations of each paradigm for different research contexts. We will also explain mixed method research and when to use complementary approaches, and selection of appropriate research paradigms for a given scenario. So let's get started. So what do we mean by research paradigm? So when you are trying to do a particular research, we have to look at three different aspects: the ontology, the epistemology, and the methodology. So a research paradigm is a set of beliefs and assumptions about how the world works and how knowledge can be generated. It shapes the questions we are going to ask and the methods that we choose for conducting our user research, and how we will be interpreting our findings that we get post our user research. So, ontology. Ontology is about what is the nature of reality. Is there one truth or multiple realities? So let's start with this thing with an example. So let's say my research question over here is, does social media usage affect students' well-being? Now, I am taking a positivist approach. So, a positivist researcher would approach this question as follows. So, the ontology over here. So, let's recall back. Ontology is about what is the nature of reality and is there one truth or multiple truths. So, a positivist will say that a single measurable reality exists. So, in practice, this will imply that well-being is a fixed objective construct that can be quantified with a score. Now, if I take the same research question and I go for an interpretivist research, interpretivist researcher will look at it differently. Their belief is that multiple realities exist and it is shaped by individuals' experiences. So how are we going to put it in practice? So well-being is subjective and means different things to each student. So now let's see the epistemology part of it. So epistemology says, how can we know what we know, and the subjective experience versus the objective measurement. So we looked at two particular approaches, the positivist and interpretivist. One of them said, the positivist said, there is an objective measurement. Well-being can be measured objectively. So I can give a score to that. Interpretivist said, there is a subjective component to it, which implies that I have to ask different participants, and different participants will have a different worldview, which is shaped by their experience, and as a result, they will interpret well-being in different ways. So, in my positivist approach, because their belief is that there is an objective truth about well-being, so it can be measured with a single score, the belief over here for the epistemology is that knowledge comes from objective, unbiased observations. So in practice, we can use certain survey questionnaire. So let's say WHO5 is a questionnaire which has been designed to measure well-being numerically. So I can offer this questionnaire to, let's say, 500 students as a survey questionnaire and identify whether their daily screen time. So I will have one question about how much daily screen time do you have, and they will do a marking on their well-being using this WHO5 survey questionnaire, and then I will do a regression analysis to see whether the screen time has any relationship with their reported well-being. So in this case, I have an approach which is quantitative methodology to test a particular hypothesis, which said that social media usage has an effect on students' well-being, and that was my question. The hypothesis was well-being is fixed and it can be measured with a score. Now coming to the interpretivist. So the interpretivist says that there are multiple truths. So what is even well-being? I need to figure that out. So their epistemological belief is knowledge is co-created through interaction between the researcher and the participant. So in practice, in order to understand how students personally experience and interpret well-being, there has to be a dialogue between the researcher and the participant. So my approach over here will be a qualitative method to explore the lived experiences of the students. So how I will conduct an in-depth interview. Now, when you are conducting in-depth interview, you cannot go ahead with 500 people. You can only do with lesser number of people. So let's say I do this in-depth interview with 15 students, and I use thematic analysis to find out the patterns, to understand the same questions, how social media usage affect students' well-being. So now you can see how this worldview shapes the different methodologies that we select. Now coming to the different research methodologies, qualitative versus quantitative. So let's take the qualitative research. Qualitative research is helpful when you are trying to explore the why and how of something. So if I want to understand why do you go to bed late at night, I have to go ahead with a qualitative research. If I want to understand how your screen time impacts your sleep quality, that is again a qualitative research, because I am trying to understand this relationship. How? So the goal over here in a qualitative research is I want to understand the meaning, the context, and the subjective experience of people. The data over here that you gather is in terms of words, images, observations, and narratives. You will have to do a sampling. So your sample will be small, because qualitative research is not possible to do with very large number of people, because it takes a lot of human resources as well as time and money resources. Your sampling method will be purposive, so that you are able to reach to the right kind of samples. You over here give more importance to depth over breadth. So what that implies is I go in depth of the why question for a particular set of things that I want to know for a smaller number of people, rather than trying to know with a quantitative research about 500 people that what time do they go to bed. So a quantitative research is better suited for that. The analysis methods that we use are thematic, interpretive, and pattern based. The outputs that comes out of this kind of research is certain kind of themes, categories, and rich descriptions and quotes. So the common methods that we use for qualitative research are in-depth interviews, focus group studies, ethnographic observation, diary studies, contextual inquiry, and think aloud protocols. When you are doing this qualitative research, it has certain advantages. So let's look at two successful case examples of how they applied this qualitative research and got good success in their business. So the first one is about firm. You might have heard about it. It is IDEO. They wanted to design a shopping cart. So if you want to know more about this particular case study, you can go to YouTube and search for IDEO and shopping cart, and you will see the entire design journey that they took. So this particular leading design agency was given the task of redesigning the shopping carts, and they went ahead with observation in different kinds of shopping environments to understand what are the current pain points that people are going through. So they watched shoppers, they also watched the store workers, how they are interacting with these carts, and they also looked at the maintenance crew in real grocery stores to identify what they should do. So they observed that carts are often abandoned here and there. So maybe on the parking lot, or most likely in a wrong place. Children also rode on these shopping carts in a very dangerous manner, and theft of these shopping carts was quite common. So these insights led them to designing a modular, child-safe and theft-resistant design. Similarly, Airbnb in 2009, it was failing badly. So the founders decided to fly to New York and conduct in-depth interviews with the hosts. They stayed in their homes to understand their experiences. Through this particular research methodology, what they discovered was that the poor listing photos which the hosts were taking, they were the number one barrier, and thus they decided that in order for the listings to do well on Airbnb, they have to actually employ their own team to take the right kind of photographs, so that the people who want to join this host are satisfied, get a better picture of what they are looking at. And then rest is history. We know how successful Airbnb is. Now coming to quantitative research. So the reason we do quantitative research is to answer what and how many. So if I want to understand what time do majority of the students go to sleep, I can ask a question. What time do you go to sleep? And I can collect this data from 500 people and get a rough idea what time do they go to sleep. If I want to understand how many hours do they sleep, then I can ask the questions, how many hours do you sleep? So the goal over here for quantitative research is I want to measure, quantify and generalize findings across populations. The data over here is in terms of numbers, certain kind of metrics, frequencies, like how often do you shop, certain kind of ratings, durations, the time that you require to do something. The sample size usually over here is you require large sample size in order to make some kind of conclusion. When you are selecting the people, it has to be random and representative of the target audience. We will discuss about this in more detail when we actually go to the statistical methods for doing these sampling processes. So here we are targeting breadth over depth. So we are trying to target a large number of people to understand what is the general behavior rather than going into depths of individuals' behavior. The analysis process involved are statistical in nature, and we try to identify the means, correlations and significance tests. The outputs over here is usually graphs, percentages, the p-values and the confidence intervals. So there are many methods. We will be discussing about surveys and questionnaires, A/B testing, web app analytics, task success rate measurement, certain established scales like the system usability scale SUS, and methods like quantitative card sorting. So let's look at two examples of success stories by applying quantitative research in practice. So we all know about Google's shades of blue. So in order to come to that shade of blue that Google is using right now, they actually tested 41 different shades of blue. After testing this 41 different shades by offering different toolbar links to different user groups, they performed something called as A/B testing, where you give a A solution and a B solution and then you try to see which one performed better. They tested it over millions of users, and they don't need to go to these users because when you are clicking, already Google comes to know whether the click happened, whether interaction happened or not. And through these millions of research, they came up with the shade which maximized click-through rates. Another example is Netflix. So Netflix uses quantitative testing on artwork thumbnails. So it measures which images drives the most clicks and viewing time across user segments. So once they discovered, they have artwork personalization schema. So depending on what kind of user you are, you will get a different kind of artwork. And they observed by doing this personalization, they are able to improve engagement by 20 to 30%. So every show now has multiple thumbnails which are served to different kinds of users based on the framework that they have already established. So not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. So from the 4 case studies that I showed you, 2 for qualitative and 2 for quantitative, you can clearly see that there is a difference between when you should conduct qualitative and when you should conduct quantitative. Both of them have their own strengths and weaknesses, and they offer you good benefits. So you have to capture the essential tension between the qualitative and quantitative research methods. See what your context needs, see what you can gather most efficiently, and take a call on the right kind of methods on the basis of that. So now let's do a head-to-head comparison of qualitative versus quantitative. So the core question in qualitative is, why do users behave this particular way? And if the same was to be converted into a quantitative, it is how many users do this. The data type in qualitative is words, images, observations, video recordings, whereas in quantitative it will be numbers, metrics, statistics. In sample size, in qualitative research we are trying to do in-depth research. So we try to, depending on how much depth, how much resources you have, you will target like 5 to 30 participants. If you are trying to do a quantitative, you might have to target between 100 to 1000 plus. Again, depends on the kind of analysis that you want to do on your data that you gather. If you are doing qualitative research, your approach is inductive, which means patterns will emerge from the data. When you are trying to do a quantitative research, your approach is deductive, which means you have a hypothesis which says that something can be achieved, and you test it whether your hypothesis works or not by collecting this data. So the strength of qualitative research is it is rich contextual data and it might result into unexpected insights. Quantitative research I try to do when I want to generalize something by gathering the numbers, when I try to have some kind of statistical confidence. So how likely it is that this particular pen will fit into the hands of majority of the people and they will be able to achieve what it is to be achieved with this particular pen. So the key limitation of a qualitative research method is it is very hard to generalize, because you did this research with very small number of people, and the researcher's bias is involved because you and the respondent are talking to each other and gathering all this information. However, in case of quantitative also we have certain limitations. So I am gathering how many. So I might miss a lot of context and the nuances which we can only capture through qualitative, which is about why do they behave in certain manner. So it's not only that whether I should go qualitative or whether I should go quantitative. Our decision has to be for what part of the research should I do qualitative and what part of the research should I do quantitative, and how do I achieve the best mix so that when I go to design something I have the best possible insights about my users. Another dimension that you need to consider when you are trying to select a particular user research method is whether you are interested in collecting attitudinal data or behavioral data. So when I want to collect attitudinal data and I want to collect it in a qualitative fashion, so I will have to do an in-depth interview and explore why users feel a certain way about a certain product. So I will have questions like, tell me about your frustrations with this particular app. I can also do quantitative when I want to capture attitudinal. However, in this case, my question will have to change. So if for the same app, I would have to ask, rate your satisfaction on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 might mean something and 1 might mean something else. So large-scale surveys measure users' satisfaction scores across different populations uses this particular method. Now let's say I want to do a behavioral research and I have decided to go by qualitative. In behavioral research, it is qualitative. I might have to do ethnographic observation of how users naturally interact with the products. So I might have to shadow a nurse using a medical device during her or his entire shift, and then I gather a lot of qualitative insights. But if I want to do behavioral and quantitative, then I will have to try to measure something. So I might try to measure the average time to check out when you're trying to do e-commerce. If I take the same example as this nurse, I might try to measure how often does she make errors, how much time does she take to complete a particular task. Is there a difference in error rate and completion time at the beginning of the shift when she is less exhausted versus at the end of the shift, and so on. And you are able to gather quantitative data. So we always, in the context of design, try to go ahead with mixed methods, trying to capture best of both worlds. So let's say I want to explore something. So I can start with qualitative research to discover certain themes. Then I will design quantitative study to measure their prevalence. So how often does it occur? So first I will do interviews, which helps me in gathering the qualitative research. Then with those I can formulate a survey questionnaire to gather the prevalence data for whatever I got from my interviews. If you are trying to have an explanatory sequence, which is like you want to explain certain phenomena, so I can start with quantitative data to identify patterns. So if I want to know that how many people are able to spot the login within 1 second of launching this particular application, then I will try to first do a quantitative data. So I will collect from launching the time to going and clicking on the login on an average, and then I will get my quantitative data. So that I am getting through analytics. Now I want to understand why did they take so much time, or was it easy to find it, or was it difficult to find it? First time it was difficult to find it, after 5 usages they remember and they directly go over there. So here I will use the qualitative method to understand why this is occurring. So I can then do interviews with fewer number of users. Then I can also do a convergent parallel. So let's say I collect both types of data simultaneously, and then I try to merge the findings for a more complete picture. So in that particular case, I will do survey as well as interviews, and then I will use it for triangulation. I will see whether what I collected in the survey is matching with the interviews and vice versa. So this kind of thing can work. Let's say I want to understand whether there is a relationship between how much you spend on your home renovation and your income. So I can collect the data from lots of people by using a survey on how much do they earn and how much do they spend on renovation of their house. And then I can conduct in-depth interviews with some users to understand whether there is a relationship. So now I will bring both the data together and I will see whether the relationship is being established by both qualitative and quantitative methods, or there is some yet another factor which was responsible for having the impact on home renovation. So choosing the right paradigm is very important. So in order to choose the right paradigm, you have to ask certain questions. What is your research question? So if your research question is, why do users abandon checkout? Then please go ahead with qualitative. If you want to understand what percentage of users abandon their checkout, go for quantitative. Now the next one is about what stage is your project in. So if you are in an early exploration phase where you are trying to discover the needs, go for a qualitative research. However, if you are in a later validation stage where you want to measure the impact of your design decisions, go ahead with the quantitative methodology. Now the next question is, what resources do you have? This can be in terms of time, money, the number of people. So if you have a small budget, few users are only accessible, then it is good idea to go ahead with qualitative. However, if you have access to a larger user base, you have analytical tools, and you also have certain resources, because sometimes you might have to pay your users also, then a quantitative user research method is a good choice to go ahead. You have to also consider what does your stakeholder need, the client maybe, for whom you are doing this. So if your client is interested more in stories, empathy, design directions, then qualitative research is what you need. If your client is more interested in numbers, statistical confidence and return on their investment, then quantitative is the method to go ahead with. So the key takeaways from this particular lecture is there are two paradigms but one goal. So both qualitative and quantitative research aim to understand your users. They differ in how they generate this knowledge. None of them is superior. You decide which one to take depending on the context. So qualitative reveals the why behind the behavior. The quantitative measures how much and how often. So each has certain blind spots, and we need to most likely do both of them in order to not have the blind spots. So mix for maximum insight. The strongest studies combine both the qualitative and the quantitative to discover and quantitative to validate, and you can also run them in parallel depending on if the context allows that. Let your question guide you. Your research question, your project stage and your stakeholder needs should determine which paradigm you should use. So here are some of the references. If you are interested in knowing more about this, you can go through these. Thank you so much. That brings us to the end of this particular lecture. See you in the next lecture.